All right, Dr. Latt Mansor, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, we are going to be exploring a topic today that I admittedly don't know much about. This is well outside my wheelhouse as a running coach, but I feel like I really need to understand this a little bit better. This whole topic of using ketones as fuel for endurance runners and everything that we have to know about that issue and all the caveats and everything like that. Maybe we can start with a little bit of your background and why you are so particularly interested in ketones.
Sure. Ironically, I started to have a great interest in this area, not because of performance. It was because of chronic disease. So I grew up with a family with high prevalence of chronic disease. So my mom's side has high prevalence of diabetes and high blood pressure. My late dad passed away from stroke. He had a heart attack before. And the whole family has sort of high prevalence of cardiovascular disease as well. So throughout my studies, I did undergraduate and my master's in biotechnology. And during my PhD, I actually studied the metabolism of a type 2 diabetic heart in hypoxia, which is low oxygen environment. So that was what got me really interested in metabolism, physiology, and all of that. And to top it all up, I was also growing up as an overweight individual as well. So I didn't start to lose weight until I was in my undergrad when I learned more about physiology, metabolism, the fact that I can change what I was given genetically just by changing my lifestyles and habits. And then, I was, after my PhD, I was in sort of a health tech startup working for a diabetes management program. And then from there, we looked at activity, we looked at food and nutrition. And then I also ran my own startup company, trying to use chatbot to help people understand the blood test results. And then I got introduced to HVMN in 2019, and they were looking for a research lead that helped them with their military contract, the $6 million contract that we currently have, that uses exogenous ketones to improve cognition and physical performance in hypoxia. So also, again, low oxygen. So imagine military personnel in high altitude or deep sea exploration or diving where they have high risk of developing cognition decline or cognitive decline due to low oxygen. And that's where they saw really promising preliminary results with the use of exogenous ketones, and they wanted to explore that more, and therefore they've allocated the grant money for it. And then ever since then, my interest has been in metabolic health and physiology. So I always tell people performance and chronic diseases are on the same spectrum. It's just one end, there are people who are much better at metabolism. And then on the other end, there is a lot of dysfunction that is going on in the metabolic pathway of these populations.
I'd love to ask you, when you say hypoxia, low oxygen environments like high altitude, what qualifies as high altitude? I'm just curious because I was wondering if I can blame my own cognitive decline on just simply living in Denver, Colorado.
You know what? One of the base that we actually ran studies on is based in Colorado Springs, because they are the mountaineering school that's based there. And we generally in the studies, in the tasks that we performed, we are simulating between 14,000 to 20,000 feet high in terms of altitude. And that's where you start to see some, especially acutely, you'll start to see some cognitive decline. But generally, humans, even to a certain extent, animals, we can see a certain level of adaptation after a week, 2 weeks. That's when your cognition and your metabolism start to adapt to the high altitude. Although what we have seen in, say, my study, my PhD study, was that in the metabolic heart, in the type 2 diabetic heart, it fails to switch over to glucose. So we can talk about that in a bit. But generally, when you go into hypoxia, your body will switch to be more reliant on sugar, because the first pathway of sugar metabolism is glycolysis. and that pathway is independent of oxygen. So it's you can actually go through that pathway, create energy without the presence of oxygen. Whereas everything else downstream from that, you will need oxygen, right? So it only makes sense that your body will prioritize survivability and then push metabolism towards glucose. What we have seen in metabolically inflexible people, such as diabetic individuals or chronic disease patients, we see an inflexibility. So they're not able to switch over the glucose. They have high fatty acid metabolism and high fatty acid oxidation, and they don't switch over. So
very interesting. So I can't exactly blame any cognitive decline just on living in Denver here.
I mean, you probably are way more adapted to high altitude than anyone else that who are not living there. So like if you go on a run on high altitude, I think you're perfectly you would probably come up advantages to compared to a lot more people who do not live in high altitude.
Yeah, for sure. Although I'm probably not going to be running up at like 18,000 feet. I don't think I have too much interest in that, but let's back up a little bit and actually talk about ketones.
Mm-hmm.
What are they? They've been described as the fourth macronutrient, which is a very interesting way of describing them in my view. And I'd love to just get what is the simple definition for a ketone? And also, can we differentiate between an exogenous ketone versus an endogenous ketone?
Yeah, sure. So, traditionally we're looking at the three main macronutrients: the fats, the carbs, the proteins, right? And now that exogenous ketones have been out there, we are starting to describe it as the fourth macronutrient. And the reason is because it is in the same category as these other substrates. It does produce energy, right? It goes into mitochondria, it produces energy. So let's start with ketones in general. What are ketones? Ketones are essentially substrates that our bodies can produce when we are low on glucose and glucose storage, like glycogen. So when you are having intermittent fasting, or when you're in ketogenic diet where you severely restrict your carbohydrate intake, your body will run really low on glucose, and that's when your body starts breaking down fat into ketones in your liver. Now, people might ask, why? Why does the body break down fat? Because we can directly metabolize fat, and we can directly use our fat storage in order to create energy, right? This is where evolution comes in and shows us that it is not the fat that we can use in order to maintain brain function, because the brain has a blood-brain barrier. So it's a barrier of cells, a very thin layer, that prohibits bigger molecule to get past the blood-brain barrier. And fatty acids are of a very long carbon chain. It's a much bigger molecule that cannot bypass the blood-brain barrier. So in order for the brain to get enough substrates, enough fuel, it needs to be broken down into ketones, which are smaller molecule sizes, in order to bypass the blood-brain barrier. So normally the brain uses a lot of glucose. Our brain weighs 2% of our body weight, but uses 25% of our daily calorie intake. So we know that the brain is a metabolically very, very active organ. So no matter what happens, it will prioritize the brain and the heart, because those organs will always need to be working from the day that we're born until the day we die. And therefore, we have evolved to create ketones from fat through periods of time where we do not have food, where we are not in abundance. If you look at historically, we have famine, we have, even back in prehistoric human ages, right? We will go for hunts and hunt animals or forage the forest, and they didn't have any storage system. They didn't have a fridge to keep everything fresh. So they will hunt, they'll get the food, they'll go through the period of abundance, and then they'll go through a period where they do not have food, where they have to go out and hunt. And that's when they have the ketone production, and they'll go through that anabolism and catabolism. And also, ketones have been proven to really give the brain not just the energy, but also the clarity and focus that the brain needs. So on top of just providing energy, it also increases the interaction between brain regions, and this has been shown via functional MRI as well. So that's ketone bodies in general. So the three main ketone bodies that we produce in our bodies are acetoacetate, acetone, and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And the last one, beta-hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, just to be short, is the main ketone body that we use for metabolism because it's the most stable. Whereas acetone usually gets released in breath. So when you're on ketogenic diet, people say you have the fruity sort of smell. That's usually acetone that comes out in breath. Acetoacetate, sometimes, it can come out in urine as well. So whenever you do like the urine test for ketones, usually they test acetoacetate, and beta-hydroxybutyrate is usually what people test when they do blood ketone levels. And that's what being measured for metabolism. And that's just endogenous ketones. And we haven't even touched exogenous ketones yet. So
are endogenous ketones created by your body, and then exogenous ketones are ketones that you might ingest that come from some outside source?
Correct. So endogenous, internal, the way I remember, endogenous, internal, exogenous, external. So that's easy way to remember it. So, all this while through human civilization or human history, we have not been able to consume ketones because our bodies make ketones directly from fats. Yes, there are certain fats like MCT oil that increases ketone production in the body, and there are certain ways that we can, certain lifestyle we can adopt in order to produce more ketones, but there have never been a technology where it produces large amount of ketones that we can directly ingest and increase our blood ketone levels until now. Until 2017 was the first time a ketone ester entered the market, and it was brought forward by HVMN. So, all this time, we know that ketones may be good for the brain. It has been used to treat epilepsy for the past 100 years, and we know the positive effect that ketones have on the brain, right? And even in the heart, actually, a failing heart, they have seen, even without ketones in the body, it upregulates ketone metabolism. It will start producing ketones because of the efficiency when it comes to oxidation and metabolism. And when ketones are available, the heart and the brain does prefer to take up ketones. And recently I interviewed Dr. Tommy Wood from Seattle. He is an expert when it comes to brain injury and brain metabolism. And I found out from him that in an injured brain, it actually uses up a lot of ketones to build the fatty acids, again, to really help with the recovery of the brain injury and build up all the structural, the structure of the cells, essentially, structures of neurons in order to recover from the injury. So, and then what happened was about 20 years ago, the US military invested some money into grants to come up with a super fuel to help military personnel to go on long and demanding missions. And through that, NIH and University of Oxford sort of came up with the idea of exogenous ketones. Because they're like, okay, we already know proteins, carbs, and fats. Like, what else can we use to really propel long and demanding missions further and make sure that our military, our operators have, top-notch cognitive performance, even after like days of not eating? And yes, they could be using ketones, but we can't put them on ketogenic diet because that's too restrictive. We can't just ask them to fast because it does have a certain level of energy, affecting these people. So exogenous ketone was the idea. And until then, we had ketone salts, we had MCT, The problem with these products, while they are cheap and accessible, they don't raise your blood ketone levels high enough to have that advantage. So that's why they came up with ketone ester. And ketone ester is just a fancy name of two molecules being bound together in an ester bond. And one of them is a ketone. So BHB bound with butanediol was the first ketone monoester that was out in the market. And lo and behold, this ketone ester managed to raise your blood BHB level up to 3 to 5 millimolar. And just for reference, if you're not on a ketogenic diet, if you're not in ketosis, your BHB level, your blood BHB level should be between 0 to 0.1, very low, right? Almost non-existent. If you're on a ketogenic diet, nutritional ketosis is being defined as 0.5 millimolar. But this ketone ester, for the first time ever, you can spike your blood BHB up to like 3 to 5 millimolar within half an hour, which is amazing, right? And that's when people started feeling the difference. They can feel the subjective focus. They can feel the extra energy without actually getting jitters. But then over the next 2-3 years, more and more study, because it became a commercial product. So a lot of researchers can get their hands on this product. So a lot of research then suddenly bloomed and looked at performance. They looked at therapeutic areas like diabetes, Alzheimer's, heart failure. So then they realized that by spiking your blood BHB level up so high within a short amount of time, you also drop the blood pH level, meaning you are increasing blood acidity. And as a result, these athletes are not getting an improvement in performance, but they're feeling that they're working out harder. They're having a higher rate of perceived exertion, RPE, and they are increasing their cardiorespiratory stress biomarkers such as breath rate and heart rates, because your body is trying to excrete a lot more carbon dioxide in order to neutralize the blood pH. And on top of that, because ketone ester tastes quite bad, it's quite bitter, so it also induces a lot of GI issues, like people start puking and all. In all of these studies, some of them got negative sort of detrimental effect, if you would, instead of ergogenic effect because of the GI issues. And it's also $40 per 25 grams, which is expensive if you're not an elite athlete with a big institution paying for your supplements. And you surely can't take it on a daily basis, especially for people who are using it for metabolic health and therapeutic users. So in 2021, we came out with Ketone IQ, which is essentially butanediol. So earlier on, I said ketone ester is BHB bound with butanediol in an ester bond. We took half of that, which is the butanediol, and made it a drink called Ketone IQ. It's cheaper. It works better in terms of not spiking your blood BHB too high, because it goes through your liver to get converted to BHB. So your liver is the gatekeeper, and because it has signals from the rest of your body, it is very good at making sure that your blood ketone levels doesn't go beyond 2.5 millimolar. And third, it tastes better. It's easier to do flavor R&D on them. So the price point, the pharmacokinetics, and the taste.
There's so much to discuss here.
Yeah.
I would love to go back and talk about ketones as energy. Mm-hmm. And I've heard ketones discussed as an energy source. And you've sort of indirectly answered this question, but I just really want to confirm. When we think about energy, there's really two different ways of thinking about that. There's caloric energy, something like you eat a sandwich, you get energy from that sandwich. And then you can get energy from a cup of coffee. And that works very differently by blocking any markers of fatigue in your brain. And so when we are discussing ketones, it's more of the former, correct? Like we are burning these ketones.
And it has calories.
Fuel,
yes.
And it has calories.
Yeah, correct. So that's a really great point there, Jason, because a lot of people, especially when we first launch, when we talk about brain superfuel, and people are, oh, it's like coffee. And I want to make this really clear here, is that coffee is a form of stimulant. As you said, it blocks the fatigue markers, fatigue receptors. It basically stops you from feeling tired, and it stimulates brain energy demand. However, it does not directly provide energy to the brain. So the brain still needs to pull energy from somewhere else, right? And from sugar, from fats, whatever. But ketones literally directly provide energy to the brain. So that's the difference. So when you take exogenous ketones, the subjective feeling of you getting the energy to your brain, the focus that you're feeling, is not the same as when you take a stimulant. So you don't get the jitters, you don't get that heart palpitation. And for me, for example, I'm very sensitive to very sensitive to caffeine. I can't take anything, like if I drink a cup of coffee, I'll start having a headache because it's just too much stimulant for me. Whereas ketones works perfectly for me, and I drink it every day before podcasts, before workout. And it just gives me this push of energy without that super, like, I need to punch a hole in my wall feeling. And that works for me. So some people, actually, they're crazy. They stack coffee or caffeine with ketones. And that works for them. Because if you think about it, they can also work synergistically. Because one increases brain energy demand, and the other one provides brain energy. So sort of supply and demand meeting the increase in demand done by the stimulant.
I'd love to ask you too, if this new way of processing ketones in the body by going through the liver, would this be potentially problematic for someone with fatty liver disease or who might be struggling with alcohol? Are there any side effects to that mechanism of processing the ketones?
So a lot of people also ask this. They are like really, wary about it. And so far, we have not seen any data that shows us that it may be even remotely dangerous to the liver. The reason being, one, we are evolved to produce and metabolize ketones already. So all the enzymes are already naturally there. We're not inducing anything new. And this is not a foreign molecule because a BHB is BHB is BHB, right? So our bodies know how to recognize it as a familiar molecule. It's not a pharmaceutical, it's not a drug that specifically blocks or interfere with a certain pathway. And two, it's only 70 calories per dose. So you're processing 70 calories worth of clean source of energy. Imagine the amount of shit that we put through our liver on a daily basis compared to this. Like, that's what a lot of people, they're like so worried about, like liver damage. I'm like, think about the things that you put through your body first on a daily basis, that you put through your liver to detox before you even think about this, because this is like a clean source of energy versus alcohol, for example. Like Andrew Huberman talks on alcohol a lot, and they really show all these studies that the small benefit that you may even get from certain alcohol may not even be good enough compared to the downfall, the disadvantages of alcohol. So that's what I would say in terms of effect or negative impact to your liver, because it is simply converting it into BHB. So from BDO to BHB, it's not a process of detoxing. It's not a process of removing harmful substance that may be harmful to your body and then create a burden to the liver. It's a conversion process. On top of that, I think, obviously if you have concern about, if people with fatty livers and dysfunctional livers, obviously do consult your physician before you take the supplement if that makes you feel better about it. Because in fact, now we have more and more doctors who actually sells Ketone IQ and prescribe Ketone IQ to their patients directly from their clinics. And we are so grateful that these doctors believe in our product because they've tried it, they've looked at the literature, they've looked at the science. We've always been very forthcoming when it comes to scientific findings and data, that they put their credibility and the reputation online for our product. And we can't thank them enough for our doctor partners, because when you see doctors who are saving lives actually prescribing this product to help their patients, that's when you know that what kind of product makes difference.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting comparison because one beer is more than 70 calories.
Correct.
So, the alcohol in a beer is typically a lot more to process. And that's just one beer. I think a lot of us have gone out and maybe had more than one adult beverage, and we're asking a lot for our liver. Latt, I'd love to move into the realm of athletic performance. We're talking to a bunch of endurance runners right now. As we're thinking about ketones, how do they affect running performance? Can you supplement with them? Is it something that you would take before a workout or a race? I mean, what are the real athletic benefits here?
Yeah, so from the studies that we have seen so far using exogenous ketones and pushing performance, for ketone ester, as I said earlier, we have seen some studies that showed improved performance, and we have seen some studies that showed no improvement in performance. It wasn't detrimental, but there was no improvement. But instead, you get the increase in the cardiorespiratory stress biomarkers, like I said earlier, because due to the acidification of blood, as well as increased heart rate, increased rate of perceived exertion. So let's talk about those studies that have shown improvement, right? They have shown, one, the glycogen sparing effect. So because you're using an alternate fuel during a race or during a training session, during a run, you are essentially sparing your glycogen so that you can go further. And a lot of these athletes, when they are on ketones, and mind you, exogenous ketones are not meant to completely replace your current nutritional strategy. It's meant to augment whatever you already are doing. Granted, there are some people who really loves Ketone IQ and they would go on long runs just on Ketone IQ without any carbs. Majority of athletes who have tried that, they do feel like they're bonking out at certain point, just because like you said, it's a low calorie, right? It does provide you with energy, but I think most importantly, what we are still trying to understand is the effect of ketones on the brain when it puts you in the right zone and really push you to be so focused in what you're doing, and therefore creating that benefit in performance. So recently we just finished a study with University of North Georgia, one of the leading military colleges in the US. For the first time ever, we are looking at anaerobic exercises, because when we talk about exogenous ketones, most often than not, we are looking at endurance exercise, because ketones were being converted from fatty acids. And when we talk about fatty acids, we always talk about endurance, because when it comes to highly intensive anaerobic exercises, glucose is still the king when it comes to, like I said earlier, glycolysis, because you are going through short bout of really high intensity that you won't have enough oxygen in your body to provide the cells to create energy, and therefore you are just relying on that glycolysis, on the glucose and glycolytic rate in order to produce the energy. But in this recent study that we did on Ketone IQ specifically, these participants, they're not even athletes, they're just active students. They went through a 5K run on ketones and carbs versus carbs alone. And then right after that, they were being asked to do an anaerobic Wingate test. And a Wingate test is essentially 5 bouts of 10-second sprint on a stationary bike at 7.5% of your body weight as resistance. So you push as hard as you can, as fast as you can for 10 seconds. You rest for 30 seconds, and then you do it again for 5 times. And what we have seen was really, really astounding, because these participants essentially increased their peak performance, peak power output, their average power output, their velocity, and they decreased their fatigue levels. So, and we're like, what is happening here? Because yes, they probably save some glycogen during the 5K run, right? But just the glycogen itself, is it enough to get them so far ahead? We suspect that there is a certain mechanism as well that acts on the brain where these people feel less pain. So sort of very similar to caffeine, where you just can tolerate the pain much better, and therefore you also can push further and harder and go through less fatigue. But it's the next stage of research to be done.
This is fascinating. One of my questions was going to be, this does seem like a type of supplement that would lend itself more to the marathoners, the ultra marathoners, the people who are going to be out there for 3+ hours for their long runs and races, because it seems to do exactly what we want it to do: spare the glycogen reserves, give you an alternative fuel source so that you can get 10, 20, 30 minutes into that marathon longer before you start hitting the wall and really depleting those glycogen reserves. And I know for me, I only really needed that extra half an hour. If I had just an extra half an hour of fueled running in my marathons, I probably wouldn't have hit the wall at all and been able to really have a strong last 10K, which, as every marathoner knows, is exactly what you want when you're racing 26.2 miles. But it also seems like it can be helpful for the shorter races, but because of a different reason. It's more the cognitive side of things. And I remember, much to my college coach's dismay, I started drinking 16 ounces of cold black coffee from like an old water bottle before my cross country and track races as a senior in college, because, at that time it was really becoming clear that caffeine is this proven performance enhancer. And it wasn't giving me any extra energy. It was more changing my psychological perspective on the race. I mean, I was standing on that starting line, just ready to punch a hole in the wall, like you were saying earlier. That's kind of where you want to be right before a short, fast, intense race. And the ability for you to not experience pain exactly the same way is very interesting to me as a coach, because, that's often the defining differential characteristic between runners who can push through that race-related discomfort and those runners who sort of succumb to that fatigue. So this is really interesting. Do you typically recommend ketone supplementation for the longer distance folks, because the data is still a little bit early on the anaerobic side of things?
Yes, absolutely. So right now we have Sarah Hall, marathoner, right? And she uses Ketone IQ. We've got Don that just finished, I believe, 250 miles that he ran in the past week in Arizona. So our CEO, Michael Brand, was running 25 miles, pacing, part of that run with him as well. So yes, it definitely still provides energy, because like we said earlier, energy is energy, right? You get the energy, you get the mental focus. It's a no-brainer, because whether or not this can help with anaerobic exercise, it still provides energy in the long run anyway. But most importantly, the difference is that now it's Ketone IQ versus ketone ester that was done in previous studies that has the GI issues. Whereas now we're not seeing the GI issues anymore. So people can just reliably count on the increase of blood BHB and blood ketone levels based on Ketone IQ. And that's why people prefer Ketone IQ over ketone esters. And then another use case actually that I haven't even spoke about was one study used ketone esters as recovery strategy. So for 3 weeks, these cyclists went through training, and after training, so half an hour after training, half an hour before bed, they were given protein, carbs, sort of standard post-exercise nutritional strategy with exogenous ketones. And what they have seen after 3 weeks is that they improved their power output by 15%. And that is also corresponding with an increased intake of calories. Now, this is the interesting part, because when people take Ketone IQ or exogenous ketones at rest, they find a subtle appetite suppression effect. But these athletes, because they've been training really regularly and really rigorously, they saw an increase in calorie intake. So in a way, ketones is such an adaptive fuel that depending on what stimulus and what activity you're doing, it adapts to that in order to maximize whatever you're trying to do. So same thing with another study that looked at exogenous ketones and glycogen synthesis. They improved glycogen resynthesis after exercise. They also have shown that in muscle cells, when taken with carbs, proteins, ketones also increase mTOR activation for protein synthesis post-exercise, which is, again, something that is useful for people who are training both anaerobic and aerobic, because you need muscles for both anyway. And I think that really drives home the message of the use of ketones in both acute settings, sort of pre-workout setting, as well as post-exercise recovery setting.
Yeah, I discuss a lot about how you can enhance the recovery process after any difficult workout or run by taking some fuel during that run or workout, because you're just going into less of a calorie deficit, and you're giving your body more fuel when it needs it, so that after the run, you don't necessarily need to eat as much, because your body is already in that process of processing calories, restocking glycogen stores, and like you mentioned, starting to rebuild those damaged muscle fibers by, starting to get some protein in. So it's really interesting to me that it's sort of like this interesting type of molecule that helps in a lot of different ways. And like, I'm admittedly a little bit cautious. Like, this sounds too good to be true.
No,
right?
this is exactly what I talked about. I think last week I was on a podcast as well, and I'm like, I know it sounds like a snake oil, that it does every single thing.
Yeah.
And
What's the catch, Latt?
It cures you. It sorts out all your problems. No, it doesn't. Right? It doesn't. And what I tell people, this is ultimately still a supplement. Right? You need to dial in your. If I'm talking on chronic disease spectrum, if I'm talking on metabolic health spectrum, you still need to dial in all your foundation, right? You need to dial in your nutrition, your physical activity, your stress management, your sleep management, before you even rely on supplement. If everything else is out of whack, just like a dose of 70 calories of ketones will not do much for you, right? But if you are an athlete, you're already on top of your game and you're trying to have that extra edge, then this may very well be able to push you further and really prime your body for better performance, but also better recovery. So overall, that compounding effect will also make it way more significant and prominent compared to your competitors, for example. So I think in terms of what is the cons, right? So one is appetite suppression. So some people feel like they can't eat a lot and they need to eat a lot. So, that's one of the side effects that some people may actually play around that and use that as an advantage. So depending on how you see it. Two is that usually 1 hour after you have ketone IQ, you also see your blood glucose drop about up to 50 points. So there's a study that looked at obese patients and diabetic patients after food, and they have ketone IQ and they see a consistent drop in blood glucose, which in a lot of cases is really good, because especially nowadays with such an abundance of hyperpalatable, hyperprocessed sugars that we are getting, lowering blood sugar and allowing our body to adapt to a phase where we are not just having chronically increased blood sugar, that may be a good thing. But if you are running, that's why most of the time I'm like, if you're running, if you're already burning all your fuel, make sure you top up with that sugar on top of ketones, and the ketones will do its best to save your glycogen and spare your glycogen, and then you're still burning the glucose and slowly tapping into your fat source as well. And another point I want to point out is that a lot of people don't realize metabolism is not a linear thing. It's not a linear pathway where it's, oh, I'm burning sugar, okay, I'm going to shut everything down. I'm burning fat, I'm going to shut the rest down. It's always in a flux. Our body is always trying to finesse the rate of sugar burning versus fat burning versus fat storage mobilization versus ketones sparing glycogen. It's always in a very delicate equilibrium, if you would, and that really it really depends on, first of all, what you are good at metabolizing, to what you give your body to metabolize, and 3, what is the current activity that drives towards one substrate and not the other. For example, anaerobic versus aerobic, right? If you're doing zone 2 cardio, we all know that you are tapping more into your fat storage and really priming your body to be able to be more effective at metabolizing fats.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's never an either or scenario. You're always burning some combination
Correct.
of both fat and glucose. And, the whole nutrition, goal of endurance runners is to prioritize what is most effective for you, depending on what type of run you're going on, what the intensity of that is, the duration of that. So, this seems like a good way to sort of manage that balance. Now, when I was preparing for this conversation, I was reading that ketone supplementation can increase natural EPO production. Now, obviously, we're not going to take exogenous EPO. That is banned. Not a good idea. Don't do it. But if we can boost it naturally, and we can boost EPO naturally, by doing a certain type of running workout or by getting in the gym and lifting some heavy weight. So it's always a good physiological end result of our training to boost natural EPO. What is your take on how ketones affect your natural EPO production?
I think, that one study came out and it was really, a lot of people were retweeting it. A lot of people were sort of talking about it. I think it's a really interesting paper for sure. And it does play into the idea of how ketones help with adaptation to hypoxia, right? Low oxygen we're talking about, and it makes a lot of sense. But it also doesn't explain the acute use, the acute adaptation to hypoxia, because EPO takes a while to essentially get produced and develop and increase in number. So that plays more into role of a chronic adaptation to hypoxia. But if we are talking about long term and just over weeks or months of you training and having ketones and increase EPO and increase oxygen delivery and oxygen usage, then I think it's a great tool. I just hope that they don't see this and they're like, oh, it's increasing EPO and then we're going to ban it as well. Because it's essentially a product, it's a food product, it's a substrate that you can take. So, and I think to a certain extent, it'll be interesting to dwell more into the research to see, do you need a certain stimulus in order to increase the EPO production? Is it just drinking the ketones and if you're at rest and whatever, and it'll increase? Or do you need to be at high altitude? What will happen if you are training every day? Is that going to increase even more, or is that going to inhibit it? So those are the questions that paper sort of brought forth, because now we can create different situations and different control environment to really dial in onto what is the actual mechanism of action that is helping this. We are now also, speaking of which, we are applying for a grant to the European Space Agency to look at ketone IQ for astronauts in terms of, hypoxia, in terms of ionization, radiation damage protection as well. So that's another very interesting point when we talk about like production of, making sure we have enough oxygen and at high altitude in the space even. So
wow, it seems like there's so many different applications to this really interesting molecule. And I've been very public about my aversion to the ketogenic diet, because it's just not something that endurance runners are really going to thrive from, especially on the average. Of course, there's probably some outliers. But it seems like this is taking all of the benefits of ketones without the drawbacks of not consuming any carbohydrate and being in ketosis through that way. So I'm really excited about what the future studies are going to tell us about ketones. Because it seems like, you said we've only really been able to extract exogenous ketones and then from there start putting them in studies and seeing how the research is affected since 2017. So we're still in the very early phases of understanding exactly how ketones can be used. Maybe we can discuss a little bit for our endurance runners that are listening, what might a potential ketone protocol look like? What would you recommend for an adult runner? Let's say this runner is training for a marathon. How could they use this conversation, the information that we just discussed, to benefit both their training and their racing?
Great question. Before I go there as well, Jason, I want to cover that you mentioned that we're still at a very early age of ketone, our exogenous ketone research. And thanks to exogenous ketones, we are also able to put people who have difficulty getting into ketosis in ketosis so that they benefit from it, from cancer research to metabolic health and all of that to performance. Because otherwise, some people, they're just not, like you said, it's too restrictive to be on the diet, or their livers are just not converting fats into ketones fast enough, or in a manner where it's enough for you to get into nutritional ketosis. So that allows you. But while we know that this is still an early age in terms of ketone research, a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to wait for like another 10 years to make sure that it's safe and all of that, right? Know that while it is early, like I said, it is not a pharmacological intervention in terms of, it's not a pharmaceutical, it's not a drug, it doesn't mess with your pathway. A ketone is ketone is ketone. We are evolved to be able to produce ketone and metabolize ketone. And butanediol, which is the raw ingredient in ketone IQ, has been found naturally in small amounts in coconut and avocado, peppers, and a lot of natural foods. So there is nothing unnatural about it. The only thing that is new is our physiological state that has high glucose and high ketones at the same time. That is the new research that's being shown that allows us to really push human performance to the next level because of the interaction between these different substrates. So that was what I was going to add. And then back to your question on the protocol. So based on the studies that have been conducted and what we recommend currently to athletes consuming Ketone IQ would be take it half an hour before you start an exercise and top it up 90 minutes into your exercise, so 2 hours after, right? And if your workout, your race is longer than that, I would top up every 90 minutes. And usually what we would recommend for performance as well, so one dose of Ketone IQ is one shot, and that's 10 grams. A lot of these studies, they're weight matched dose. So they follow 0.3 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. In which case, if you are like 70 kilogram person, they are taking up to like 35 grams, which is 3 doses. So way higher doses than what we recommend. But because we want this to be essentially a fourth micronutrient, even for people who are not using it for performance, they can just take one dose for productivity, for work, for cognition and all of that. So for performance, a lot of athletes would start with like 2 doses and then half an hour before, and then top up 90 minutes after you've been exercising, just top up 1 or 2 more doses as well. Some people prefer to take a dose after exercise for recovery with carbs and protein, just because from the study on the recovery. So I think that hopefully that's helpful enough.
Yeah, I'll just share my personal experience. I've used Ketone IQ a couple times, and it's certainly something that makes me feel more focused. I can certainly feel those cognitive effects. I did forget to take one before our conversation today, which is probably why I just feel a little bit slow and off my game here. But
it's Monday. It does that to everyone.
Mondays. So yeah, I have experienced that. I have not taken it 30 minutes before. a long run or a really challenging training session. So I haven't experienced any performance related benefits there. But what's really interesting to me is taking it after a long run, for example. And I'm using myself as an example here because after long runs, I typically feel low, not just from an energy perspective, but also psychologically. I need to go just sit down on the floor and, scroll on my phone and just be totally unproductive for a little while. And I did find that after a long run, there is so much less of that foggy cognitive cloud that sort of takes over your brain after a really challenging long run. And that to me is huge because all of a sudden you don't have to dedicate your entire day to your long run, which I used to do. And it used to take up like an 8-hour period because of all the preparation and then recovery and then, cognitive recovery that had to happen.
It's like a full-time job.
Yeah. It seems like this is great for those performance runners who are doing long runs and challenging training sessions, but that are also just busy people and then need to get on with their day and go to work or be there and be present with their family. So I see a lot of benefits in that regard.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think on days which I'm really busy having like 3 podcasts back to back, and then I'm going to go work out, and then I have a deadline to finish a document, it really helps me keeping my sort of productivity level. Like my brain doesn't just go wander around and just, that fatigue level, you're just zoning out. Literally, you're staring at your screen and nothing's coming out. I think that has really helped me, powered me through all those days. And I think a lot of athletes, they found the recovery part as well quite useful in terms of, like I said, in the study that we looked at anaerobic, you just literally feel less fatigued, which in a lot of cases that makes the whole lot of difference because now that you've done your training, now that you've got that out of the way, you want to do your other stuff in the day and making sure you have the energy, both brain energy and body energy in order to complete your tasks.
Well, Latt, let me just say that as a podcaster, I am very impressed by the fact that you've done 3 episodes in one day. That is an enormous psychological challenge.
That is the limit, though. That is the limit that I've done. I did not push for anything more than 3. Anything more than 3, that would be too much for me. And I think it also, I believe the 3 that I did, it was a mixture of both being interviewed and interviewing. But I think, which actually, now that we thought, I'm sorry to get off topic, but what do you think is easier, interviewing or being interviewed?
I think it's easier being interviewed because you don't really need to control the conversation. You don't need to make sure that you're being a good host. You don't need to deal with any of the technology, making sure that, all those things are working correctly behind the scenes to make sure that the listeners are going to get a good conversation. So
right.
Being a guest is easy. You just show up,
and just pull whatever is in your brain.
Right. I mean, there certainly can be some prep beforehand, but being a guest, I think, is a little easier.
Yeah. I think I was, because at that point we were recording some live podcast in LA, because I'm based in San Francisco. So I went to LA. Our editor at that time was based in LA, and they have a studio. So I was like, well, let's jam everything like to make sure it's cost efficient and do everything in one day. So, and then after that, I haven't done that since. I think that was the end of last year. It was really taxing. And I believe I've done one time, it was like 8 interviews in 3 days. And I was also fasting 2 of those days, 48 hours, just going through it and just be on ketone IQ. And that got me through.
You mentioned that the brain eats up about 25% of
daily calories.
Either the body's calories or glucose. I forget which one it was, but I wonder what it was on those days.
Yeah. That would be a good science experiment to have. Yeah. Especially if I'm fasting, like the rest of my body is probably going to lower whatever physiological function there is to conserve energy. But then I'm also doing something that is cognitively demanding, and therefore my brain will probably turn up the demand for physiological energy. So yeah, you got a point. Great point. I don't know.
Yeah, there'd be an interesting study, especially for this podcaster. I'd love to know the results of that.
Yeah.
Well, Latt, this has been super interesting just to learn more about this very fascinating molecule and how it can be applied for both physical and psychological benefits for athletes and busy people too, who just want that mental edge. Is there anything I might have missed that our audience of runners might want to know about ketones, ketone supplementation, potential drawbacks of ketone use, how they might use it in their training?
I think we covered pretty much everything. We cover MCT, ketone salts, ketone esters, and then what ketone IQ is, being the latest generation. Some athletes also find ketone salts, because of the salt load, they find it a bit difficult when it comes to increasing the dose, because when you increase too much on the ketone salt, you might induce GI issues, or you just get like water retention, huge water retention, and then you just feel unwell. Apart from that, I think we covered pre-workout sort of protocol for acute setting. We covered anaerobic, which is the latest study. It's still under review. The paper should be out in a couple of weeks. And we covered recovery as well when it comes to using in conjunction with carbs and protein for both glycogen resynthesis as well as mTOR activation and protein synthesis.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to continue to experiment with ketone supplementation in my own training and everyday life, because it was just something that I noticed this immediate difference in how I felt. And it was actually quite nice. It didn't have the same jitteriness or sort of anxious, like I'm stimulated, but I don't know what to do next. My brain's all over the place, that sometimes you can get if you have too much caffeine. And then, of course, now that it's getting a little bit warmer, it's almost summertime here in Denver. I can't wait to go out and do some longer trail runs when the trails open up. So it's going to be a really nice experiment for me over the next couple months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people like yourself, athletes, you guys know your body the best, right? So when you take Ketone IQ, I really love seeing the light bulb turn on when they're like, oh, I feel different and I'm so in tune with my body. And then when they go for a run, they're like, oh, I do the same exact route and I've got, the same exact distance, but I feel like right after I finish, I still can go for another run.
That's always nice.
Yeah.
Well, Latt, this has been super interesting. Thank you for your expertise and all the work you're doing. I can't wait to continue following it so that we continue learning more about this.
Thank you for having me.